very exciting evening, and it's a very beautiful evening. I don't normally stand up to introduce our guests, but I feel I have to this evening because I am very excited. When I thought of who could we have as a guest In Conversation, I thought about any famous people that shop at the Greenery. And for many years, I've watched Bill Henson come in and been absolutely petrified shy to speak to him. When he came in and purchased something, I'd watch him looking around at things and just wanted to see what he could see because he's an amazing photographer. I just want to read a quote. We've been talking about gardens, that's what we'll be talking about, but I just want to read a quote that really made me happy today. It's by a art critic who works in Washington, Sebastian Smee. No other living Australian artist has produced as many images so full of tenderness, silence, and longing. That's what I love about what Bill Henson does. He seems to create moments of where we just want to stop and look and we listen to what's inside of us. We're going to be talking about music, I hope, as well. So everyone, I'd like to welcome Bill Henson to In Conversation. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm worried about this mic.
When we invited Bill on, he couldn't come to the November session because he was in Paris launching a book, Paris Opera, which sounds absolutely wonderful, and it probably ties in with a few of the things that you do and you're interested in, music, including music. It's an amazing concept, which I wondered if we could just talk about that for a little bit, if you could just explain what you did. I think it was in 1990, early 90s, that you were commissioned to do this project. If you could explain, yeah.
Sure, thanks, Kelly. Well, I had an art dealer in a commercial gallery in Paris for many years called Urbi et Orbi, Rome and the world, if you like, and a wonderful young guy who was a dealer who made his money to keep the gallery alive by dancing in the Folie Bergère. So he was gay but not camp, tremendously intelligent, and over the years showing at this gallery, he had people coming in, and one of the people that used to come in regularly was a guy called Jean-Luc Mézot, who was the administrator for what was then the two opera houses in Paris, the Salle Favart and the Garnier one, the big one you see on the postcards. The Bastille, the new opera house, hadn't been built at that time. And he asked my dealer to have my contact details, and they said, we'd like you to do something for us as a commission, as a project. We don't really mind what it is. You could design sets, you could design costumes, you can film a production, you can make photographs of, we just love your work. Typical French, you know. At the time, Jacques Lang was the Minister for Culture, and I'd already done an installation at the Palace of the Popes in Avignon, which, you know, he was pretty enthusiastic about. So the arts funding government sort of side of it was very enthusiastic. It didn't take me long. I thought I wanted to photograph the crowd. I wanted to photograph the audience because I'd been photographing crowds for a few years before that in what was then Eastern Europe, and then more recently, perhaps in the beginning of the 80s in Melbourne. But a large auditorium full of people gathered, a darkened space full of people all gathered, awaiting some special event, struck me as a really interesting thing to try and document. More formal than, let's say, people on the street or people crossing the road from Flinders Street Station or people standing around on the streets of East Berlin, as it then was. So I proposed that. They loved it. Went back and forth to Paris, photographing, you know, I had all my things set up and I could photograph rehearsals and I could photograph the audience, which was the main thing. When I got all that material processed and looked at it back in Melbourne, I found that it was technically okay. You could see all it was clear to see. The problem with it was that it still felt like a document of some other event, whereas I wanted the photograph to be the event. So I restaged all of these pictures using the material in Paris as a kind of a resource and a set of examples, and I restaged all of these in my studio in Richmond. Because I needed the pictures to be more wooden, more unreal, more artificial in a way. Francis Bacon, the English painter, would say, well, of course, art is artifice, you know. But the thing with opera is exactly that. Outlandish story, ridiculous characters, you know, a completely mad state of affairs. But when the magic of the acting and the music takes hold of your imagination, it all becomes entirely real, like a documentary. I mean, great works of fiction feel like documentary, whether you're reading Dostoevsky or whether you're, you know, looking at whatever picture. So it took a while for the French to get their head around the fact that the pictures they were going to get were made in Melbourne. But when they saw them, they fell in love with them. So that was done in 1990 and 91, and my publishers in London sort of said, oh, we'd like to do this next. We've done about 10 books. And so, you know, they'd never all been printed. There'd been exhibitions of them at the Pompidou and at the Tel Aviv Museum and all over the place. But they'd never been printed as a complete set of images, and there were about 50. So that was what I was up to in November.
In November.
Yeah,
Okay,
and so the whole thing that interested me was that thing of people being in a public place together, but sort of that sense of being turned inward, as though, you know, we all pass each other in the street, but there's this interior world that each person has, and it's a completely unknown thing, partly to themselves, but to others as well. So there's this whole inner world operating. You're walking down the street and, you know, who knows what your feelings and thoughts are, and you pass another person. But to have that large crowd all gathered with that sort of sense of expectation, it's an uncomfortable thing in a funny way, being in an auditorium. You know, the Germans, of course, have a perfect word for it, Erwartung, anxiety and expectation mixed. And I wanted to try and capture that so that you could see that sort of communal thing, and yet each person had also, or was about to be taken away to another place, if you like, distracted in the French meaning of them, to be taken away to somewhere else. And so those were the things that interested me about it.
Yeah.
That's what got me going.
Yeah. I think the
and
photographs...
always interject. I should say that, you know, hecklers are good for you. They're like fibre in the diet. So if I'm not making any sense, feel free to interject and go, what?
Yeah. I think when I looked at the photographs, I saw people who were in another world. It's like something was coming into them and they were putting something out, but they were very unconscious of what they looked like, or and like all of your photos, to me they're like the start of a short story, your photographs. Like in your mind, you look at that and you think, what is that person thinking? And you can imagine the story that they're thinking, or what the music is that they're listening to. And I just loved that you're deliberately showing people doing something else, and they're caught up in that moment. And then you see their neck or their hand.
Well, you see, the thing is, photography, look, no medium is more or less intrinsically limited than any other medium. It's what someone does with it. Someone will come along and do amazing things. Doesn't matter whether it's painting or sculpture or music or whatever. You know, they're different. They're very different in their own ways. But photography has a peculiarity, and that is that we come to all photographs as evidence of something. We come, after 200 years, conditioned to look at any photograph as proof of something. Objects in space, events in time, there's the photograph. So the evidential authority of the medium precedes any individual reading of a picture. Now, that doesn't happen with painting. It doesn't happen when you're looking at a Watteau or Rembrandt. It doesn't happen when you go to the theatre, and you're going into the theatre to be taken on a journey of the imagination and a journey of emotion. But photography has this thing about being, proof of something. What interests me and why I got into tertiary education with a painting folio. This whole lot of stuff I'd done when I was about 12. I stopped painting when I was about 12 or 13. But what interested me about it was that it seems the most profoundly contradictory of mediums, because that prescriptive thing, it's a teacup on a table, no way around it, there's the photograph, it existed at a certain point in time. You want to hang on to that because that's the natural power of the medium. It is the natural power of the medium, but you also have to skip right over the prescriptive into the suggestive. You need to be able to look at a teacup, photograph of a teacup, and suggest the world, if you like, to introduce notions of the abstract, things to do with them, things to do with emotion and the spirit and things which we can't nail down particularly. And doing that with a photograph seems almost more unlikely and a bigger surprise when you can pull it off.
Yeah.
Because we've got to get over that. You've got to hang on to it and at the same time lose it, lose that kind of proof thing that a photograph is. So, and once you've animated, if you've successfully animated that suggestive potential in the medium, that's when your short story starts. Because there is no correct way of looking at Rembrandt, there's no correct way of listening to Mozart, there is only your way. And so each person goes on their own little journey, and who knows where it is. I would never presume to put a thing next to a photograph and all saying, oh, by the way, this is how this picture is going to move you. It's, no. You know, it's so presumptuous, it's so mad.
And I think I read that's why you don't name your photographs, because you're trying to cut down on that, telling people what they're about or what they are.
Well, I'll go off like sideways. It won't be about the specifics, it'll be about things that I think are important or that I think are important for everyone. And with art, it comes down to, I think, what's necessary. In history, really great art to me looks like stuff where someone has done what was unavoidable and essential and necessary. And necessity is a great word when you're thinking about art, music and literature. There's a fantastic, some of you will know this, he's long dead now, this wonderful Italian filmmaker, Federico Fellini.
What do you mean we don't know?
Yeah, almost everyone, I'm sure you do, right? Well, Fellini, what a genius. And Fellini used to say things like this because he was, he was always trying to sort of step outside the circle. And despite whatever else, and the films are so beautiful, but the thing is, he said, you should only ever do what's necessary, but of course, sometimes the most outlandish things are necessary, right? And so you do what is necessary. It's a very important word. Yeah.
I just want to say a personal thing. I read the art critic Sebastian Smee talked about seeing your photographs and the effect of your photographs on him and his love of art. It was almost the start of why he loved art, which is an amazing and wonderful thing to give to someone. Sometimes your photographs
He did come in as a young boy and he'd want to talk at my shows, mainly at Oxley's in Sydney or New South Wales Art Gallery. And then one day he came in with this very beautiful, very shy girl trailing behind him, who he'd crossed the campus at Sydney University and heard someone playing a violin in the conservatorium, went in and it was this girl, Josephine. Anyway, years later, they're married, they've got kids. He's, critic of the Boston Globe and then the New York Times and now the Washington Post, and won a Pulitzer as the best art critic in America. And, he rang up, 3 weeks ago for a chat. What's it like over there? Yeah, it's like that over here too. It's really weird. It's really weird.
Is he from Melbourne?
Why is everyone obsessed with knowing about everyone else's psychosexual sort of persona? Why is it on the front of all the papers? Can't they just be like? We'd have. We still talk regularly.
Well, that's a wonderful sort of thing to give someone, isn't it? Like that whole art. I just want to say I had a similar experience, but not with your photographs. I was in an exhibition years ago in Canberra called Old Masters, New Visions, and I walked into a room at the end. It was a tent. It was a room of a tent, and similar to your photographs, every wall was covered with these paintings, and I could feel the energy and the thrum of life coming from the doorway, and I didn't know what was there, and it was a series of Rothko paintings.
Oh, right.
But in those paintings, they do remind me of your photographs. There's that depth, like a depth of black that contains everything. That's how I would describe it. So,
there's a writer,
understand.
An old friend of mine who died last year, sadly, Peter Sheldale, who was a critic he was a critic for the New Yorker, but before that for the Village Voice, the New York Times, anyway, poet. The Americans have been very lucky with contemporary art because they've had the great fortune to have a series of tremendous poets take an interest in the visual arts. Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, Sheldale, and Peter Sheldale would say had a friend called Dennis Cooper, who's a novelist, an American novelist, a very good one, who was staying in his apartment, and he fished this catalogue of mine off. I don't know where Peter had gone. Peter and Brooke, his wife, had gone somewhere, and he wrote a whole essay about the black in the photographs. It's like being caked on, and is it going to come off on your finger? He had all these, And Peter had some original works on the wall. But the whole essay, it was in Art Forum years ago, but it was like about black.
Yeah, I
So
do
it's
have a quote
important.
from that actually.
Yeah.
Dennis Cooper called Henson's black
there
is
we are.
a unique achievement. That's what it is. It's that deep blackness and
Well, it's
colour
one of
in
the
black as well.
Yeah, and it's one of the ways that it's one of the pathways open to you to get around, to hang on to, but also get around the prescriptive. Because it's what happens, I think it was I'm borrowing words from David Malouf, an old friend of mine, and David said, you know, it's often what goes missing in the shadows that animates the speculative capacity rather than what you can clearly see in the highlights. And so it's something that, you know, I think people do pick up on from whatever direction.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
yeah.
So, and I think Dennis Cooper was saying you wonder whether the blackness is going to encroach on the subjects and completely obscure them, and then of course it's going to look like a Rothko, isn't it?
It will.
Or a late Rothko.
Yeah.
Those
And it
black
feels
ones.
like everything is there, just behind it. Yeah. And you trust that they've got everything. I always thought it was like everything in the world was contained in that painting, which was sad for me, but also happy that it existed somewhere.
There's a beautiful essay by an American critic called Dory Ashton. Dory Ashton wrote a major book called The New York School. She grew up, she was contemporary of Rauschenberg, of Pollock, Rothko, all these, Franz Klein, all that period. And she wrote an essay for Art International, and it was published after he died. But she'd been to see him. He's very depressed. He had all the Russian sort of the thing in him, and his wife Mel used to go, like, it was like this the whole time. So, it's like the Old Testament for breakfast, so like this. And she went to visit him in his studio, which is a converted carriage house, an old carriage house in New York. And he had these parachutes strung up under the skylight so he can minutely adjust the level of the light. And it was winter, and it was very dim, and he was, like back in Russia, I suppose, to some extent. And he had those pictures with those sort of shimmering sort of tympanums, the sort of silver and dull white, hovering over kind of inky reds and inky blacks and whatever else. And Dory Ashton sort of writing this just after he died, and they were close friends, she said, standing in that studio with the afternoon, the winter light dying at the end of the day, and looking at the forms in those paintings, those, abstract paintings, was like watching, was like listening to the fading kettle drum in late Mozart, which was a lovely thing to say. That was her goodbye to Rothko. So music and painting, music and photography, all of these things are very important. And it's weird the way you can find equivalences, but they are parallel universes. They're not the same, because I believe that what happens when, let's say, if I go to see a couple of favourite paintings somewhere, and I have all these old friends I go to visit at museums and have, saw, let's say, pick one, late Titian Shepherd and Nymph in the Kunsthistorisches in Vienna, which I saw when I'd been working in Eastern Europe, and came out, went to Vienna, stayed there, sat on a velvet couch in the old gallery and watched this one painting for about a week, trying to work out what colours were in. You couldn't tell what colours were in it. You just couldn't tell. And back then, because it was designed as a picture gallery, it had skylights. It wasn't a converted palace. They didn't have the lights on very often. So when a cloud went over the sun, the whole room would just go down, and then it would come up again. It was like the building was breathing, And you sort of, of course, well, this is the way this painting was seen for the first 400 years of its life, not a Mercedes-Benz showroom with bright white walls, So watching things like that, you come to understand that the most important thing that happens when you look at a painting can only happen when you're looking at a painting. It's about the object. And when you look at a sculpture, the most critical things that occur to you, that means to the great intelligence of your whole body, not just your eyes and ears sort of thing. That's a Nietzsche thing. Nietzsche used to say, it's the great intelligence of the body, all the information's going in through your skin, all the primary conditions of life on Earth, gravity, velocity, temperature, barometric pressure, everything that you are, it's information going in all the time. little bit gets up here where we can think about it, but a lot of it doesn't. And so the whole thing is the great intelligence of the body is reading all this stuff when you're approaching something. And when you're approaching a photograph or a sculpture, any kind of object, walking into an architectural, you know, it gets bigger when you get closer to it, it gets smaller when you get further away. It's like music. It gets louder when you're close. All these fundamental and seemingly simple things condition our responses. And you'll never get exactly what you get out of reading Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain or something, in the same way you'll get whatever you get out of looking at a Titian or a Rembrandt. It's always different. So it's not the same, but they all tend toward that, you know, if you like, abstracted sort of sense of the world.
When you, I know music is incredibly important to you, and I read a quote that I found really quite funny. You said, well, I'm not sure, perhaps I never listened to music recreationally. Do you think you did say that?
I did. Oh no, I did say that.
Yeah. Okay.
I said it. You know, we're very good friends with Dick and Sarto, Richard Tognetti and Sarto, who run the ACO, the East Australian Chamber Orchestra, and we automatically get free tickets to everything forever because I did a whole collaboration with them, but we've known each other for a long time. I don't always go. I'm not in the mood to go. You know, most of the time I'm not in the mood to go, and it kind of did their heads in a bit because they'd come down, they'd do their 8 or 10 national tours, and they'd do the Hamer Hall matinee on Sunday afternoon, then they'd do Monday night. And we wouldn't go, or I wouldn't go. And Richard's sort of like, why? You know, I'm playing Bach, you know, why don't you come? I said, because I'm not in the mood. I've been listening to Cello Badaci conducting Bruckner. How can I just switch off that and onto what you're playing? I know you're in town. Come up for dinner. So we'd see them on Sunday night for dinner. Most times they're here, but we don't necessarily go to the concert. I said, I don't listen to music recreationally. Took them a while, but then they got it.
Okay.
They love it.
Yeah.
But,
so why do you listen
you've got to be
music?
in the mood.
Is it a work thing? Is it something that you use?
Yeah, I never use it when I'm photographing, when I've got a camera, especially not if I'm working with a model.
Yeah.
But when I'm sitting in the room, in the studio on my own, which is 99% of my time, looking at a picture, thinking to myself, I don't buy it, you know. You can't do the Woody Allen thing, you know, pull out experts from behind the potted palm, you know, like Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. That's fine. You know, just keep, it'll be fine. Do another one, you know, pushing you back. You know, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Annie Hall, I think that was.
Okay.
But no, you're alone, so you have complete freedom, but you have total responsibility. And music, sometimes when you're working, sometimes you know you need silence, and music is intensely annoying and the last thing you want. But other times, music creates shapes, emotional shapes in our sort of psyche, and those shapes and those moods can sometimes help you resolve formal problems in the way you make a picture. It can be just a simple shift from a minor key to a major key, or something that happens. It can be a change in tempo. I'm mainly talking about classical music here, but I mean, you know, there are things in jazz that I like very much as well, but I don't play it very often. But there'll be something that changes in the structure of the music, and I'll have listened to it, you know, 300 or 400 times. You know, the same, you know, the slow movement from Mozart's 11th piano concerto with Marie Pariah and English chamber over and over and over and over again. We have soundproof walls, so Louise doesn't need to listen to it. She can listen to Akadaka on the other side. Because it's telling me something. It's telling me something. It's an intuitive intelligence, not just a sort of a civilizational logic, you know, stop at a red light, go to green light. There's an intelligence, and it's emphatic. It's not wishy-washy. It's definitive, it's definite, but you don't know what it is. Or you know it's got to be a certain way, but you can't find that way. And finding sometimes the right piece of music can take me months. Okay. You know, and I'm going up and down the vinyl and up and down the CDs. Okay. It's like going, you know, I never listen to the radio because they're never playing what I want to hear. Yeah. But when you find it, there'll be something, for example, I'll give you a specific example of how it works. That's the best way to do it. Years ago, I made these bridges at night, these white concrete bridges stretched across a river at night, or seemingly at night. And I had to find this bridge. I found a bridge and I was taking pictures looking across it at night, and I was making full-sized exhibition prints, and I was just, there's something wrong with this. And then I just woke up one morning and said, bridge is meant to be side on. And it's only through actually working away, working about, just thinking about it and watching it, that simple, very simple, turn it side on. You know, it just comes to you. So I had to go out and find a bridge, a different bridge, which I could see side on, but I wanted this black forest behind it. And I found it, the bridge over the Grey River down on the Great Ocean Road. Beach on one side, forest behind it, standing in the estuary, lights all the way up the creek, you know, running off deep cycle truck batteries with dog clips on them, and you know, and flash and moonlight and lightning, sometimes storms, you know, back and forth and back and forth. Got these pictures, and I was driving back at 3 or 4 in the morning after this fantastic thunderstorm, and the tide was coming in, so that, you know, you're standing there with a tripod and it's getting higher and higher, you know, you're in the estuary. And I was listening to one of my desert island, probably my desert island disc, which is a thing called Song of the Earth, Mahler, Song of the Earth, and the final movement. It was him putting off writing his Ninth Symphony. He was spooked. All these people wrote their Ninth Symphony and they didn't finish it or died, and so he wrote his 8th Symphony of the House, and then he kind of decided to write Song of the Earth. See if you get under the, you know, do limbo under a rug and come out the other side, which he did. Then he wrote a Ninth Symphony, but it's a song cycle, but a symphonic song cycle, 5 movements. And the last movement, which is called Farewell Abschied, is one of the great pieces of all time, not just romantic music, and it's about half an hour long, and it's a song a woman sings, there's a big orchestra. But listening to that, it's based on Chinese poems that were translated. They just were translated to German, which he couldn't read Chinese, by a guy called Hans Betke a couple of years earlier. We're talking 1907, and he was reading these beautiful poems which he'd never sort of been able to read before, and he set 5 of them to music for this song cycle. And it's all about sort of saying farewell to the earth. It's a bit like the last Schubert song, Farewell to the Earth, it's called, D 840 or whatever it is. There's 900 Schubert songs. It's the very last one. Anyway, listening to this music, I'm driving up the Great Ocean Road. The rain's still pouring, the lightning. I've got all my pictures, and I've run out of film. That's how I finally thought, this is too mad. I have to pack up. And I realised that when you use a telephoto lens, this is how kind of technical, simple stuff mashes with other things which you don't fully understand. And you go up and down with a camera. Those of you notice how the horizon bends up or down, and that's called barrel distortion. When the lens is distorting things, and if you hold it in the middle, the horizon in the distance, if you're on the nullable plane, is flat. But if you go up, it bends, and if you go down below, it bends. And I'd been doing that with this bridge, taking photographs, because it was a telephoto lens. It was along the bridge was a couple of 100 feet away, and I just realised it was a Chinese bridge. That was the one I wanted. It was a Chinese bridge, and it was listening to that Mahler song that just said, yeah, it's a Chinese bridge. It's meant to be like this, easy, So things are revealed to you through the process of working.
Yeah.
That's the specific collision of music and making a picture, but it's just an example.
I'm sitting here thinking, how did you become like this, Bill? How did you become so smart?
Oh, I don't. You think meant like, it was like playing golf and I kept hit by lightning one day.
It's incredible. I do know that some people are here that we did go to Parang College as well. So I would like you, a good question that people, it's normally about school reports and, but what were you like in high school? How did you go from there to being who you are now? Could you see what you were like in high school and you're still the same?
Well, this week I was going to have a lunch with 3 retired lawyers who I was at high school with, who've had their careers and are now kind of, organising their affairs and going out to lunch. And that's what I said, you're trying to get out of business.
Do you mean sexual affairs or
no, financial affairs.
Yep.
They're retiring, and so you'd have to ask them probably. But I can tell you, I loved primary school, and I was always down on the, in the mud making sculptures and drawing things and everything else. And I really detested high school. I had friends, didn't mind the people, but, you know, sport and science was its main focus, and it was very good academically. I mean, it regularly beat a lot of the private schools and Melbourne High, you know, the sit-in exam, all that sort of stuff. It's a very good academic school and very, very good principal and vice principal. But I think I was already away with the pixies. I just wanted to make pictures.
Yep.
And it got worse when I went to Prahran College. So I didn't do year 12 at Glenwavy. I managed to kind of like I just wasn't going, you know. And so I went into what was then called a preliminary year.
Okay.
And that was like you could do your year 12 at a number of tertiary institutions. You had to do what was in matriculation or year 12 English. The rest of the subjects were sort of more aligned to the art course. That didn't help either, because when I went into first year photography, I got in with a painting folio, as I said, but once I started doing first year photography, I loved Athol Smith and John Cato and a couple of other ratbags that were teaching photography. Very funny people. They'd never get a job now in a tertiary institution. If there are a couple of, I think there are a couple of them still hiding under their desks at Melbourne Uni. I know two of them. They're just hiding. They don't want to be found because they'll be out. You know? They'll be out because they're too eccentric. I mean, all the great musicologist that used to be, what was his name? Used to be at Melbourne. You'd get up in the lecture theatre. 10 o'clock, who's going to join me in a glass of red? And all these suburban kids, like, you know, but he was a great communicator about music, this guy. Yeah. Wouldn't get a job now. So in Prahran, despite the fact that I had Athol Smith and John Cato and some other very interesting people there, I just didn't go, you know. And before the end of first year, Athol, who was retired, you know, very, very, very famous society photographer, when all the film stars, Vivian Leigh, when anyone came to Melbourne, they all had their portraits done by Athol. And John Cato, whose father, Jack Cato, wrote the first history of the camera in Australia, went to the South Pole, did all kinds of things. John was also part of this very glamorous practice up at the top end of Collins Street called Smith Cato Bar, I think. And one day they invited me, and I'd go in with a bundle of pictures I'd made. I was busy making my pictures, but I wasn't doing their assignments. I was just making my pictures, you know. I'd come in with a bundle, and Athol would go. He used to sort of sit there in this kind of fantastic houndstooth sort of, you know, frock coat and these kind of perfect trousers. And he used to call. We were all in jeans. He called us the Blue Army. You know, the Blue Army. Yeah. But a small office downstairs at Prahran. Very small. When you opened the door, you couldn't see him at his desk. The smoke was so thick. Athol lived on scotch, black coffee, and cigarettes. Wow! And he looked like a brilliant insect. He was very thin. Yeah. And he'd just take he had an ebony cigarette holder with a Sobrani Black Russian in it, and he'd just take it out like Jack Nicholson, and go, fabulous, like the Joker, and you know, it's like that, fabulous. And everyone used to laugh because we were all kind of smart little hippies, and we'd say, look, you take him in a picture of a girl in a bubble bath, you know. Oh yeah. Fabulous. No, everything was so. He was a moral example because everything was good. You know, everything fantastic. Keep doing it. Just, you know, don't worry, you'll get over that. Just do it more. Keep doing it. And one day Athol just said, Athol and John were looking at this row of pictures of ballet dancers I'd made, which would have been 73, 74. I think I was in first year in 74. Yeah, I was. And they just sort of, Athol just pulling his head, listen, Kate and I have been talking, this Cato. We think you should just piss off and make your own work. If you want the ticket, in other words, if you want to, you know, get the degree and then teach, and like it's what most people do in art schools, you're going to have to do the assignments. But why don't you just fuck off and do your work? You know? And so I did. I left at the end of first year, or just before the end of first year. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, Athol, you know, had got a couple of people. One of them, Les Gray, and someone else who were trustees of the National Gallery, and said. They all knew each other because Athol was involved in setting up the photography department at the National Gallery, first in an institution in Australia. And he got these people, he said, come down and look at these pictures. And they had a look at these pictures and it was like this. And so Athol, we got together at the beginning of second year, and Athol sort of told the class, which was a very interesting experience for someone who was 18 or 19, I've got some great news. The National Gallery are going to give Bill a show. Anyway, you could have cut it with a knife because you could see all these young art students go like, You know, why you? You know, big surprise to me as well.
Yeah.
So I did a show that year, which was July 75.
Yeah.
But so Param was great. I mean, you had Sandra Levison, who was head of printmaking, doing burnouts in a Triumph Stag, convertible Triumph Stag in the gravel driveway out the front.
Yeah.
So when you did because there was a lot of, a lot of people looking at Ed Kineholtz and a lot of the kind of minimalist sculptors and big influence from America. They'd set the sculpture department, do a project online. They probably had a bit of a rising inflection, let's have a coffee. And they had a bit of that, but not as bad as it is today. It's really bad now.
Yes,
and,
it is.
It is like full A, and like. So one guy just went out and wired all the parked cars in High Street together with a piece of, it's a line of cars. And someone else sort of took a tram trip down to St Kilda Road and back, and it's part of the sculpture. And it was quite mad.
Yeah.
It was quite mad.
Yeah.
I just kept making my pictures.
Yeah.
And Athel was right. And then we saw each other occasionally after. He said, "You knew what you were going to do. We could." And John, who just before he died wrote me a nice letter after I had my punch up with Kevin Rudd. It was a beautiful letter saying, what a disgrace. And he sort of said, we couldn't teach you anything. And he died about a year after that, but he'd retired. But for better or worse, that's the way it was.
Yeah.
I mean,
so you had that exhibition when you were 19 at National Gallery.
Yeah.
And did it just keep going from there? You just did exhibitions on and on and on? And that's how
I just kept making my stuff.
Yep. Yeah.
That's all I was interested in doing. The last thing I wanted to do was be a commercial photographer. The last thing I wanted to do was teach. Oh, very good. I'm much more interested in what I'm doing than what you're doing. So not a good teacher.
No,
I wouldn't have been.
No, fair enough.
I mean, I've spoken to the education department of the Art Gallery of New South Wales gleefully informed me that I'd spoken to over 250,000 school children over the last 50 years. But that's, on two conditions. They ask me, I don't go around trying to do it, I do it for nothing, so it's free. But that's a lot of talking.
It is a lot of talking.
It's a lot of talking.
Yeah,
but if you spend most of your time in a room on your own, coming out and sort of fielding really interesting questions,
which
when they come,
yeah.
is kind of refreshing, and it you've got to think on your feet. It's good fun.
When we're walking out in the nursery, I don't know why, Bill likes to go into corners of nurseries, dark corners, and perhaps shade houses and hot houses. You were talking about that.
Yeah, ferneries.
Yeah. And so that brings us to the gorgeous, wonderful, like we all have childhood gardens, and we all would love to bring that garden with us throughout our whole life. And Bill has been trying to do that. I've seen some photographs of, actually it reminds me a little bit of what Barry Teese did here sometimes. He would crane plants in. He'd look after them.
Yes.
He'd wrap them. And the people who did it were careful with them.
Yeah.
But there's photographs of your garden in Northcote. We're having huge, I think it's a camellia, craned in, it's on its side, from your mother's garden. How lucky you are to be able to do that and
well, it's a matter of priorities. My car's worth $2,500. But if it costs $10,000 to move a big tree, fine, it's a bargain.
Yeah. How successful have you been
it's priorities,
in moving that garden?
Well, my mother's garden, we used to come here over the years. My mother's garden, you could stand in my mother's garden, you couldn't see the house. The house was a 1950s wooden house, nothing particularly special about it, but my mother had a really great eye, so everything looked beautiful. You grew up having kind of, long conversations about whether we should move that mossy rock a little bit round like that because it's not right where it is, and and some of them are quite big as this rug, sort of a couple of tons, nothing you can't move with the tip of a crowbar.
Okay. See,
I was very interested in ancient Egypt when I was a kid. And, you just think like an Egyptian and you can move anything. Just a tiny little bit of a crowbar underneath and a bit of steel pipe and you can move. I've got to move a few, rocks that are probably 2 to 3 tons. Easy. Not that many, but so when my sister and I had to sell, we felt we were ready to sell Mum's house about 5 years after she passed away, because it was letting go of the garden that was the important thing. Most of it went to either her place or my place. And the really big things went up to established tree transplanters, because they're the guys that I've known for years. Graham Davis started it, and I think Matt, his son, runs it now. And they had a wonderful guy working for them, Joe DeCerio. Joe grew up as a kid working, I think his parents might have had a market garden near the original established tree farm, really, in Wandon. Now they've got a huge thing up at Hoddles Creek, and one up in Albury, and there used to be one in Gembrook as well. But Joe was this kind of natural, you know. There was a big old, what was it that I just, you know, I became, you know, covetous, and it was Sempervirens stricta. It was an Italian cypress, and it was growing in the disused land next to the old APM, or the Amcor factory in Fairfield. And, you know, they planted gum trees and everything else that used to be there, because there was a bunch of houses there years ago. It was just letting, you know, they were either cutting it down or it was dying. And I sort of found the, you know, groundsman or the person, the engineer that looked after it. I said, do you want that, or can I have that? And they said, yeah, no, we just probably cut it down eventually. And I said to Joe, this is I've done this lots of times with Joe, but I said, it's, you know, this beautiful old Italian cypress. And I said, what do we do? I said, you know, he said, well, we said dig a trench 2 by 2 metres around it. He knew what was under the ground already. I can tell it's, you know, it's got soil about to there, and then it's got sort of colloidal clay under that. We'll go around it 2 by 2 metres. We'll go down 1.5, dig that out, fill it up with water, put some root stem in it, mixed in with the water. Then we'll backfill it. Then I'll see you the same time next year, autumn, of course. Okay. And so it just sat there with a ribbon around it, and the trench was filled back in. And he came back with a crane and a semi-trailer, a long one. He'd drilled 2 holes in the trunk, about that far apart, put these 2 bars through, put them onto separate hooks on the crane, and the crane just lifted it up, and it just came off the clay. So it was about nearly 1 metre thick, exactly 2 metres by 2 metres. And I'd been told, he said, prepare the hole. So I used to dig the holes by hand in my garden, just to sort of, you know, keep myself in reasonable shape, just with a shovel and a shovel and a crowbar, you know, on the way to China, like Bugs Bunny or something. Anyway, and when we got there, and they just turned it like this, and they put it on the truck, and the heavy part, the soil in the trunk was against the cabin, and the tip of the tree, and this tree would have been 60 feet, 20 metres, 60 feet high, and the tip of it was just shy of the back of the truck. He just had a head.
Yeah.
Joe was amazing. Got it to Northcote. It was brought through the factory. It's got a big roller door on each side with a Franner crane, those small cranes that have a jib running over the top of them. And I'd prepared the hole, and they just stood it up in my yard. And then he got into the hole, and my hole was like, had an optically flat bottom. I just, you know, I'm very OCD with things like this.
Yep.
Make it exactly the way he said. And he said, all right, and he grabbed a shovel, and he spaded about 3 shovelfuls back onto this dead flat hole, and he sort of smoothed it over with the slightest, about 1/2 inch to 1 inch rise in the middle of this otherwise what was a flat bottom. He said, put it in, and I said, well, and what was that? He said, it's so when it goes down, the root ball closes in, tightens around the base of the trunk. It squeezes all the air out of the cracks.
Yep. He's
really
amazing.
good, really good.
Yeah.
Well, his most interesting job when he was working for Established Trees, I think it's the Royal Brisbane Golf Club, was right next to that big bridge over the river in Brisbane, and the state government had decided to duplicate it, and they were going to take a slice off one of the fairways. And the fairway had all of these giant Moreton Bay figs, the big classic 100-foot wide Moreton Bay figs. There are 8 of them, I think, or 9 of them. And so the golf club was compensated however many, you know, maybe $1 million or $2 million or whatever for the land, and they just decided to move the trees. And so they got Joe up there, and Joe said, yeah, sure, no problem, we can move those. It's only money.
Yeah.
When I said, I'd really like an old Nothofagus Cunninghami, you know, the Myrtle Beach, the proper original tree of Australia, not the eucalyptus. You know, they found fossils of Nothofagus camei in Antarctica,
Right.
when Australia was joined to Antarctica.
Yeah.
That's the original tree of this continent, not eucalyptus. Anyway, and a far more beautiful tree in my opinion, and doesn't create fires and things. Anyway, Joe goes up there, they put on all this steel, they have 4 pod cranes, they dig this trench, they bore through, they put cables through, they weld cages around it with sort of substantial steel, and they just lift it up, 500 tonnes, move it across, put it in the next hole, next one, not a problem. Huge buttress roots, trunk 10 foot across the trunk.
Yep.
Not a problem, it's only money.
Yeah.
I love that.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Oh, I love that.
That's wonderful. We were talking before about your garden, how you need a bit more garden space.
Oh, yes.
And you're hoping to expand where you live in Northcote. Tell me about Northcote. Is it a good neighbourhood? What's your neighbourhood like?
Well, we've been there for 32 years. So when we moved in there, if you lay down in the middle of High Street Road, people would drive around you, which not anymore. But, there's a lot of money. There was no money being spent on hair and coffee.
Yeah.
But now it's all coffee and hairdressing salons with names like Hair Can Do or You Wish. Very strange names, hairdressing salon, Anyway, so a lot of that, not much else. So it's changed. It's a bit hipsterville now. And the trendier it gets, the higher I make my walls. I think I was always a curmudgeon though. I mean, I was curmudgeonly when I was 5, I'm sure. So it's good. Half the people in the street have got a key to the gate. A few of them have got a key to the house. They will let themselves in and sit in the garden and have a drink on Friday afternoons.
Lovely. It's
very civilised. It's very old-fashioned. Anyone goes anywhere, someone else will kind of take the letters, put the garbage bin in, do whatever. So it's a very civilised little area where we are on Ruckus Hill. That part's great.
Do you have a view of the city?
No. Fortunately, we miss the city. It's just where the old Northcote Theatre is.
Yeah.
1912 or 1911, first electrified theatre in Australia.
Okay.
And the town hall behind that. So we don't have to look at the city because it ain't pretty now.
Okay. Yeah. I do love. I've been coming home from seeing bands many times, and you're in a cab and you go over Ruckus Hill. It's a great name as well.
Yeah. Have you seen pictures of Ruckus Mansion before they pulled it down in the 30s?
Is it in that area?
They're in the little Northcote history book.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Actually, near Ruckus Hill was where I went out with my husband for the first time for dinner, which was the start of everything.
Do you remember the restaurant?
ABC Cafe, I think.
Down in Westgarth?
Opposite the cinema.
In Westgarth,
Yeah.
That's right.
Which was wonderful. It was the first time anyone paid for my dinner.
Oh, okay.
And that wasn't just that, it was everything else that he was. Anyway, I shouldn't...
And look, after dinner, you could have gone out and laid down on the road.
I could have
driven around you.
Why not? Yeah. Okay, let's talk about... I had a question specifically about birds in your garden because I read that you had this idea that you hadn't seen any spotted pardalopes in Northcote, and then they started visiting your garden in Northcote, and I believe it totally, that they've come there because of what you put into the garden. Do you think so?
I don't know. I'm not a good judge of the critical intelligence of pardalotes. Whether the tree cover in Melbourne is disappearing at a faster and faster rate, just right across the whole suburban landmass, 100 kilometres of Melbourne each way. So there's less and less, tree cover anywhere, and that probably sends people to areas where there still is a decent amount of kind of greenery, and that's probably it. There were pardalotes in my mother's garden, but I think it's a bit of a long bow to think that they've sort of, followed the truck with the trees down the freeway. I think, no, I think that's a conversation. That's a conversation for some of those coffee shops in High Street.
Because I'm a bit of a bird person. What about your magpies? Tell me about them.
Magpies. Magpies.
Is it a family?
Well, no. One of them sits up in a tree and has chats, in autumn mainly. But obviously, along with the currawongs, they're kind of out to kind of rob the smaller birds of their of their chicks. So, but scrub wrens, which are a lot of scrub wrens, which are now almost endangered species in Gippsland. But we've got scrub wrens, we've got pardalotes, we've got lots of spotted thrushes, a lot of male and female blackbirds, lots of blackbirds coming and going, and some other things that visit occasionally and make sort of mysterious noises which sound like you're in the Daintree or something, and they often park themselves in the big Moreton Bay fig that's on top of the hill there. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of birds, and they get used to you because you provide the magic water. If and all the insects lift, and of course the birds go crazy. So anyone who's sort of in charge of sort of making it rain, they'll just they'll come and sort of park themselves next to you, and sometimes occasionally sit on your knee.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's
so
very
that's quite
special.
Good. Yeah. The little people, I call them.
Yeah, good. The little. I memean, we don't have pets at home, but we do have magpie family, and they're the thing that I go home to, and I love it. Yeah. We talk to them, and they're very smart creatures as well. I think so. We have an ageing staffy, which we got as a rescue from a friend of Louise's who was a truck driver who lived in Dandenong, and he suddenly started getting jobs to drive to the Northern Territory, so he was away for a week at a time, and this poor, how social these animals are, and it was under a house for its first year of its life, and being fed by the neighbours and stuff, but the worst thing you could do to a Staffordshire Terrier amongst other breeds. So he realised that we couldn't go on, and so we adopted him. And so Mr. Pigs, as we call him, because he sounds like when he snuffles and truffles, has a few bad habits. He's no good around other animals, but he's great with people. Good. So that's the other animal in our little world who's now getting a bit long. Does he sleep in your bed? No, he's got his own sort of bed, which is in Louise's study. He's got a few beds, but he's getting a little bit long in the tooth now, so we're now, well, he did something to his paw. Louise is away skiing at the moment, and he did something to his paw, and I realised I was going to have to just tone up that core a little bit, because carrying 27 kilos up and down the stairs. Is that what he is? He's big. He's got shoulders. He's not an Amstaff, but he's got big shoulders. Yeah. He's very solid. Yeah. And so I could just see kind of what an ending that'd be. Very messy. Very messy. Very messy. Anyway, Bill, what do you like to read? What do I like to read? Yeah. Most of the authors that I read are long out of print. And one of my people that I talk about books to mostly is an old mate of mine, Barry Humphries. You know who he is. Barry's a complete bibliophile, and I think I'm a bit of a bookworm as well. And whenever he's in Australia, we always get together. And seen a bit of him recently, and he always wants to know what you've bought. He wants to see, what he's, because it's always mischief with Barry. Barry hasn't had a drink for 40 years, so his recall is amazing. And I like a glass of wine still, and he thinks I should stop. And so when we're sitting at the dinner table, he comes up for dinner and stuff. He says, "Who's that second Vienna School composer who had such a big influence on Bernard Herrmann, the American guy that wrote Cape Fear and all the great film scores in Hollywood?" I'm going, "Oh yes, it's and he goes, "It's the booze." And then I go, "Zemlinsky," and he goes, "Oh, very good. Touche." So we have this kind of thing, and standing in front of one of my bookcases, he said, "I can see all the people that you've collected in depth and read extensively. They're all exiles." Starting with Ovid, all the way up to all these eccentric Englishmen that went to live in Italy, Harold Acton, and there are lots of them, And so a lot of the people are, a great, amazing woman author, totally out of print, I think now, called Vernon Lee. Her real name's Violet Paget, but Vernon Lee, if you can find a book of hers in print, you'd be lucky. She, along with Walter Pater, who is an art historian, who wrote a very famous book called The Renaissance. The two of them were responsible for reintroducing the Italian Renaissance to the whole of Europe, particularly Northern Europe, who thought the last high point of Western civilization was the Gothic period and the Gothic cathedrals. The Italian Renaissance was not Michelangelo and all this stuff. That was not a big deal
up until about 1880 when they started, and then you had Bernard Berenson and all these other historians jumping on the bandwagon, and now you can't turn a corner without Michelangelo and everyone else from that period. But it was out of fashion, and it wasn't considered the high point or one of the high points of Western. It was seen as a moribund reinvention or revisiting of the classical, the Romans and the Greeks. So Walter Pater and Vernon Lee, between them, turned the whole European mind around and back onto the Renaissance. Okay. She wrote quite a few books of, what would you call them, of the supernatural and ghost stories, a la Edgar Allan Poe and whatever else, brilliant ghost stories. But most of her writing was about the beauty of the landscape in Italy, particularly Italy for her, the architecture, the art and gardens and the landscape. There's a guy called Norman Douglas. You might be able to find his most popular book, South Wind, it was called, in print somewhere, but he's completely out of print. But Norman Douglas was a genius who, German-born, educated in England, entered the British Foreign Office, was in Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution, died on Capri in 1952. But he wrote these books which were broadly seen as travel books in the early days, a few scientific pamphlets about various things. But they're the most amazing books about a place and culture. He wrote about North Africa in a book called Fountains in the Sand. He wrote a fantastic book about southern Italy called Siren Land, about the Sorrentine Peninsula, which comes down, and Capri and then Naples back up the bay. He wrote a whole range of amazing books, but they're saturated with this deep knowledge of antiquity. And of course he was fluent in Latin and Greek and all this sort of, he really knew his history. So there are all these books, and that's another thing that an author I really love reading. And someone who is, you just won't find the books anywhere. Yeah. So that's the sort of things that I'm reading.
You mentioned the word saturation, which reminds me of something I read about you. You say that you studied the Parthenon in Rome for 40 years. I did read that about you. Anyway. Pantheon, sorry. Yeah. Yes, yeah. I loved your comment about it, which was the saturation of culture, like a longevity of culture that seems to inform that city or that building sometimes. It's almost like you have to have that history to produce something like that. Sometimes I feel like I can be in a city and I can feel that history, like in Istanbul, that was there everywhere. And it was also in the people.
Oh, that's right. You won't see an 8-storey Macca's next to the Pantheon anytime soon. No. And it's not that the Italians aren't quite corrupt in their government, but it just won't happen. It's a culture of the eye too. Sometimes you think of the British and even more the Irish, it's a literary culture. Going back to medieval times, let's say going back to Henry VIII, there's almost all these accidents of history are really interesting. There's virtually no English wooden sculpture in existence from before Henry VIII's time, because when he set up the Church of England, when there's this break with the Catholic Church, a lot of the monasteries, the Cistercian monasteries, and were sacked, and a lot of that got divided up amongst the landed gentry and so forth. But a massive amount of what was there was wooden and was burnt. And so, if you look for a textbook on the history of English sculpture, there's a big hole in parts of it. So it's very interesting. So to get back to the culture generally, Italy's definitely has always been a visual culture to me. Everything always looks good. It seems right. Yeah. And so even though I love the books that I lived in, Thomas Mann was one of my great loves, and more recently, The Great Rat Bag from Austria, Thomas Bernhardt, if any of you have read him, the Austrians. Thomas Bernhardt died in '89. He won the Nobel Prize at some point, but I had a wonderful curator who grew up in Innsbruck, who was a curator at a lot of the museums around Europe where I did shows, called Peter Weiermeier. And Peter Weiermeier was this great big bull of a man too, big beard, everything else, didn't matter, but he'd sit at a table and you'd be doing a group show you know, in the Kunstverein in Frankfurt or something, and there'd be Russians and a couple of Chinese and someone from Korea and, you know, a couple of English people and someone from somewhere else and an American, and you just go around the table speaking speaking all their languages. You know, absolute, when it came to languages, a complete polymath. You know, just to hear him speaking Russian to the Russian guy, and then he'd whip over there as a Japanese person speaking, you know, perfect Japanese, this sort of thing. Very, very interesting guy. But he had a great sense of humour, and we did quite a few shows together. And he said, you know, I divide the world into big haters and small haters. That's how I work my way through life. You know, some people are big haters, and I said Thomas Bernhardt was the Austrians. He said, oh yes, they're mostly big haters. It's true. He said, and Bernhardt was a big hater, but they're like the blackest humour and the maddest books, electrifying. And the other one, recently, that I just to finish on the books thing, was probably W.G. Sebald. W.G. Sebald, who was a great genius, really, who died quite early, tragically. You know, was driving his daughter to a school where she was teaching in Oxford and had a heart attack and ran into a truck. So, you know, he could have been still writing, but incredible books. And Sebald really brought that whole idea of it's a novel, but it's actually a documentary to a new level in literature, where he goes for a stroll around the coast in East Anglia, and he's, it's called Rings of Saturn, this book. And he starts talking about things, and all of a sudden he's talking about the silk trade in China in the 1600s, and talking about something else, and how this led to the building of you know, spinning mills in, you know, Arkwright's frame and all the historical developments in weaving and spinning in London. And then he'll be on to something else, and it's just, he weaves this thing, and there's an immense amount of history in it, but it's, to what extent it's actually fictional and in his imagination. It's very hard to tell. There are no divisions in it, so these books exist as a sort of almost a new genre, you know, a magic realism, if you like.
Okay.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
I did see a photograph of your library. Izzy sent me I did use a swear word when I looked at it, because what is that, his effing library? Because I thought it's enormous and it's amazing and looks gorgeous. There was a series of photographs, and it's beautifully lit, of course, and we've got a lot of books at home, and I look at them now and I think my main worry in my life is that I won't live long enough to read all the books that I have.
Oh, right.
Do you think about that?
No,
I know it's
I don't worry
depressing
about
and
it.
sad, but it's, you know.
No, it's good. It's good. There's all that stuff. Maybe you'll get to it, maybe you won't.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Has anyone got any crazy questions?
Hopefully. Has anyone got any questions? I know there's a couple of people here from Paran College. There's a lady over here.
You can ask anything you like.
Yeah.
This is anything. I'm particularly interested in your garden.
Oh, yes.
And could you just describe what you have, or how you've made it, and do you work in the garden yourself?
Yes, I was working in the garden yesterday and banged my head. So, you know, I'm always, I like to work in the garden. It's not of any particular style. I mean, I've got a big gardening library, and I've read a lot of books by different people. One of my favourites is the thing called Ji Cheng, which is, it's broadly seen as being the first practical gardening manual, Chinese, 1630, I think, translated by, I think it was the University of California, translated and published it. And it has all kinds of really practical advice in it, which is the kind of advice that I had in my head before I read this book, and I thought, this is my... And the book was full of things like, when you take a piece of land, always make the high part higher and the low part lower.
Okay.
And when you introduce a body of water into a garden, always make sure it has a curve in it, so you can see the reflection of the moon through the willow in the water. Practical gardening advice. So I love that. So mine had no particular reference in Japanese, Italian, it was really just about what pleased the eye. And we'd be long before I read that book, it's a sloping site. So when you come out of the factory, which I use as a studio to shoot in, which is not the factory with my library. I mean, it's like Cicero, what's that thing of Cicero's? Cicero said, if a man has a garden in a library, I think it is, the Latin, he'll want for nothing. Well, my garden's not in my library. But you come out and it goes to the next street, so it goes from street to street. And I excavated the middle of it. So it had a very slight slope, because I did want it to drain, but just a small slope. The land, you go up to the end of the garden, then I did a dry stone wall, a retaining, and then there's about 3 metres around the edges to the property boundary. And there's a 2-storey place on both sides. Far end is a sort of a wall I put up on the street. I tapered it slightly in toward the end, very slightly, just to increase the sense of perspective, you know, so it looks bigger than it is. All those tricks that started with Humphrey Repton and, you know, the English kind of, the English tricksters as I call them. And I put a dry stone wall in there. It's Coldstream stone. It was the tip truck that delivered it told 2 lots told me it was, how do you tell from his truck, I suppose, was 60 tonnes of Coldstream stone, sitting at about 7 degrees. It's clay up on top of the hill, so that the weight of the stone just continues to sink down very, very little really on the natural clay behind it. So that way it stays there. But there's no cement between the stones. And then I had an idea. I started to introduce things. I remember at the time we were in a very long drought. So I think I bought this in about 94 and maybe started in about 95 or 6 working on it. And I can remember because someone who I got to know, Ted Baillieu, who wanted to be the Premier of Victoria at the time, was in the paper somewhere saying some idiot had told him to sort of come out and say, oh, we should dam the Maribyrnong River. And I thought to myself, and I told him this sometime, I said, oh, you're not going to get in, you know. Just seemed like some mad idea. So, but very nice man. I think he's a very nice person, actually. A good person. Anyway, but that made me get some tanks. Because I thought, oh, well, you know, this is what's going on. So I have tanks inside the factory. And I wanted to plant things which were indestructible. And it's an old, as I said before, working class area. There were no street trees. A lot of concrete from the 50s and 60s, mainly Greeks and Italians. The remnants of the Victorian hilltop, it still had a few old mansions, and that and the hilltop in Toorak were the 2 expensive house building spots back in the 1860s and 70s. Some of them are still there in Northcote, but they've been badly compromised. But I thought I need to put in trees which I like the look of, and also trees, obviously, that are pretty tough, that'll withstand a lack of water. And so the 2 things that I like, firstly, having had a long love and fascination with Egypt, and having spent time there in the 80s photographing it and so forth. I mean, I was obsessed with it from probably the age of 10 anyway. So I saved up and bought Howard Carter's 3 volumes on Tutankhamun's tomb, which is, you know, all this sort of stuff, you know, very, very, and books from Cheshire's bookshop on Egyptian architecture. It was a major part of my development of understanding objects and sculpture. Francis Bacon, the English painter, sort of said, well, when asked by Melvyn Bragg in a great interview, which is on YouTube, you can watch it, he said, now, Francis, he says, you think a lot of Egyptian art. He says, oh, because he's kind of very flamboyant and gay, Francis. Oh, well, of course, you know, Egyptian sculpture is probably the greatest objects that have ever been made. But of course, they were artisans, meaning they could really make stuff. So it's something which is almost completely gone from arts education now. They can really make things. You just got to look at the way the stones put together in the buildings. You know, the Romans used mortar and stuff. The Egyptians are mind-blowing. So palms. I wanted to have these palms, Canariensis. And that's when I sort of met Graham Davis, who started Established Trees, and palm trees, no problem. How big? Which one? What, you know? And they'd put a palm tree and they'd be gone by 8 a.m. They'd be gone by breakfast time. You know, stand it up. I bought one in which is 35 metres high. The only trouble I had is getting it up High Street. This is all at 5 in the morning and around and down the street. And Joe, the guy I mentioned before, in typical style, had backed this gigantic crane onto my property on this concrete driveway, because it used to be a factory, with these 3 wheels, and each set of wheels moved independently, backed it down to the far end. And when the extended roofing trailer with this palm came down the street, after taking about 20 times, it couldn't quite get through my gate. It was a big gate, but it couldn't quite get through. And Joe just sort of goes, yeah, brings the crane down, strapped up the whole truck with the palm tree and put it in a different position. It's a semi, big semi. And then he backed up a bit further, and then we put the tree up. I'm looking at it, and I'd been instructed to dig a hole 2 metres deep by 3 metres square, so it's a big hole. And that's how big the block of clay was with the roots. And they put it in, and I can remember when they started to take the slack off the crane, the tree went, never going to blow over.
No.
So apart from palms, Shinus molle, peppercorns, which are South African originally and a dry earth plant, very tough. And some time later this is what they do, they go out and they're widening, they're duplicating a freeway somewhere. And this was out in the Western District somewhere, basalt plain underneath it, very dry. And there were this line of old peppercorns, and they were going to cut one of them down. And of course, Graham or Matt got word of it and sort of said, we'll dig them out and take them away for nothing. So they went out and they got about 20 of these old peppercorns out, brought them all back to Hoddles Creek, stuck them in their thing where they put all these big trees. And I said, yes, I'll have, yes, thank you, yes, please. So I had 4 of those put in.
Yeah.
And their trunks are like this now. So, and they're getting that wonderful, crazy, wizened, beautiful structure that they have. And they're the sort of bones of it, along with a few, sempervirens, Italian cypresses. I have 3 of those that are probably 20, 25 metres high. Okay. That's the bones. And then the understory. And the understory is interesting because you can't plant many things underneath a Canary Island palm and they'll have them live because the roots are so aggressive and so dense. So having put in the structure that I want, the start of the structure I wanted, I had to go, all these other trees that I love having, I love, Sasanqua camellias, the smell is just, it's one of them, and it's a thing I grew up with in my mother's garden, and I'm very attached to them for that reason as well, of course. But you can't put them in the ground because they're just going to die. So I have a lot of large pots, which I've accumulated over many years. Most of them Italian pots. So there's that, and then there's a lot of rock work as well, a lot of mossy rock. Then there's a sort of a central area which is just raked gravel. I work out my OCD thing in the morning, like raking the ground, So, but it's not really meant to be a Japanese garden at all. But it's just how it looks. Yeah,
how it's come together.
And you can get out and rake the gravel, and you can get over almost anything if you.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So beautiful. That's sort of. I don't necessarily gives it a very clear visual thing, but that's how it started anyway. Yeah. Now it's very hard to fit anything in sideways, which is why it needs to get bigger. It's the only problem.
You need bigger.
Yeah, well, it's the only problem with most of the great gardens I've ever seen. They're too small.
Yeah.
It's the problem with almost every garden. The only thing wrong with it, it's not big enough. As a general principle, that's how I see it.
Any other questions? They're shy.
Come on. This is like come on, I know. Just a question. There you are.
Yes. So.
I have a question about a comment you made in relation to music creating space.
Yeah, shapes.
When you're working shapes.
Yeah.
And historically, I've had quite a lot to do with dance, and that was a very interesting concept to me because I think people often think that dance is dance to the music, but in fact, what the music does is it creates the spaces within which those dances move, and it's not the gaps between the music, it's actually the space of that music, the story it's telling creates, and therefore the choreography works with that. So then I asked myself, well, is it with photography then, to what extent are the spaces important rather than the subject when you're...
Well, the shadows, absolutely.
So is
the black.
Is that just as important to you as the subject?
Well, yes, because I've always thought, since I was making things out of clay as a kid, I'm interested in things. I'm interested in objects. So I think of myself, in all honesty, as making things that happen to be photographs. And if I thought I could get closer to whatever it is, I don't even understand it, but something that's powerfully apprehended, perhaps, but not fully understood, maybe that's a way to describe it, by working out in a lump of clay or wood or some other thing, I would do it, because it's a means to an end. You know, it's the thing that allows you to go on that journey of discovery. And in Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, there's a great line where Aschenbach sort of says, you know, artists are a bit like hunters, you know, firing arrows into the dark. They don't know what they're looking for and they don't know whether they've hit it, you know. So in a way, it's a means to an end, and therefore the spaces are critically important, because this, you know, the space defines an object, you know, in a way. The space is, you know, you can call it, some have got negative space and positive space, you know, however you want to talk about it, whatever the semantics are. That's very important. But when you mention space in music, it made me think that actually particular performances or recordings of performances are really, really important to me, and others are not important to me at all. It's the same composition. Really important. I mean, I can't just bung on anyone's version of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 or whatever it is. You know, there's certain people who create remarkable shapes, and that's what I think great conductors do. And a lot of it is a space, a lot of it is a silence. And you've only got to listen to the last, you know, you can look at bits of this, you can just flick on YouTube if you've got premium without the ads, and, you know, the whole $8 a month, it's the only thing I pay for. Everything's on there. But if you look at a great, like the very last performances of Claudio Abbado with the Lucerne Festival Orchestra, just before he died, and he did this final cycle of Mahler symphonies, and it's weird. It's like another great favourite of mine is Michelangelo, a pianist, Arturo Benedetti Michelangelo, who died in the 90s, I think. Amazing, playing Debussy preludes, playing all kinds of things. But when he's playing and he slows down, he's not actually slowing down, it just feels like he's slowing down. When you play it to a musician, you know, musicians with good ears and who really understand all this technically, like this is what my pet, you know, being a nuisance, is to always play Richard and Satu something when they're up that they've never heard, because they know more about music than most people, you know, and that's why this Australian Chamber Orchestra is so great. But that's the thing. All right, listen to this, you know. So I put this thing on, and one night Satu was down, Richard's partner Satu, and I said, listen to this, and I played Michelangelo, and it was the slow movement from what? Allegretto, what's it from? Beethoven, No. 3, with Giulini conducting the orchestra. And it just goes along, and the tempo, it's not so the tempo changes, but somehow there's an intonation occurring in the way that you can hear the notes. And it finishes, and so I knew Satu had never heard it. And she's like this. She goes, my God, you can go out to lunch between the notes. You know, in her Finnish accent, you know.
Yeah.
Oh my God, you know, go out to lunch between the notes. That's it. So it is, the space is the music too. And dancers who I photographed a lot many years ago, I always think that the faces are very interesting because they're kind of inward, a bit like the people, you know, waiting in the opera house. It's sort of like they're lost to something. Or they have, you know, it's that great song, I've Become a Stranger in the World, which is probably the greatest song that Mahler wrote. It's an incredible thing. You can hear Fischer Dieskau and Gerald Moore do it. It's just mind-bendingly good. Or maybe, no, it's Fischer Dieskau and Wolfgang Sawallisch, who was a great Wagnerian conductor who didn't feel like he could do this anymore, and so he became an accompanist on the piano, and a great one. So it's particular people doing particular things and creating, you know, mind-bending magic. And it's exactly the same magic, really. It's of the same significance and the same importance as turning a corner in the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, and seeing Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal, which is probably one of the greatest objects hanging on a wall in Europe. And you know the story of the prodigal son. But this is a very big picture for Rembrandt, painted right at the end of his life. And people walk past it because there's 8 kilometres of stuff to see in the Hermitage. But they all sort of stop and they don't know why, and they're talking about stuff and they forget what they're talking about. It's like it's the power of the painting. They're not even looking at it. It just has the space around the painting is electrifying. And when you really study it, as I've done, I spent a week there photographing people going past it, organised this thing with the museum so I could do it. But it's as though you could pick. It's as though somehow you could pick bits of pathos off the painting. The paint wasn't a representation of pathos, it was actual pathos, which of course is impossible. But that's when things become really great. They seem impossible. It's impossible that someone's pulled this off, but there it is. And that happens in music, it happens in literature, but it happens in the visual arts as well. And so that's when things get really interesting for me. That's when I'm excited, when I'm listening to something, for example, the music, and it's like I just can't believe what I'm hearing. It's just ridiculous. Yeah. It's entirely unreasonable. And it's a cardinal quality of what I consider to be, historically and broadly speaking, great art. I've got a really simple definition because, when you're talking to school kids and they think, great art, what's great? Something that profoundly affects a large number of people over an extended period of time. Sort of a simple way of putting it. Okay, so what happens is, it's that sense of, you get the shock, but the shock can last for decades when you see these pictures. Or you hear these performances, or, you're sort of in Magic Mountain reading this insane Thomas Mann book, whatever. And the thing is, it's as though these things are just inside the physical world. Talking about objects. They're just inside the physical world. They might just as easily not exist, but they somehow, against the odds, do exist. And it's like borderline inside the world where you or I can see it, touch it, smell it. And that gives you a gathering sense of shock. And I think in my life to date, those shocks last for decades. It's a continuous shock. You go back and see Rembrandt's small painting of a stone bridge with a stormy clouds going, this burst of sunlight hitting this tree. It's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I saw it when I was backpacking around Europe in the 70s. And I'm thinking, Rembrandt is 1606 to 1669, so this painting was done in 1637, I think, and he's pretty young. It's a beautiful little landscape. And I'm going, look at that. What you're feeling, or what your intuitive intelligence is telling you, is that, not your logical intelligence, the painting was painted in 1637, but the feeling is like the sunlight from 1637 is still hitting the tree now. So it's almost like you're getting into quantum physics. Everything's in the present. It's still here. And then years later you go back and see it again, it's like, oh, I'm 10 years older, and it's still hitting the tree. And then the picture gets brought to the National Gallery on a tour, maybe 20 years later, and I go to sort of visit it, and I go, look at that, paint. The sunlight's still hitting the tree now, 40 years after I first saw it, and nearly 400 years after it was first painted. So it's all in the present. And so that sense of disbelief, almost, of amazement, is the thing that you feed on, the thing that carries you along in any medium. In any medium. So, now, being a master of the subordinate clause, that was a long answer, but I'm happy to take another question if you like.
I think a lady had a question back here next to Karen. Yes? Yeah.
I read a history about Montserrat.
Oh, yeah.
I have no personal connection to Montserrat, but it was written by the residents of Montserrat. And I wonder, and I suppose they were winding down, they were at their prime during your art career. But would your peers have had anything to do with the art community at Montserrat, or were you two completely
different? Well, it was a kind of an artistic community, and it's before my time. When I was, I think maybe in Form 1, 12 or something like that, I think we were taken there as a group, as a class, like an art outing in a bus from Glen Waverley to Eltham. And I remember sort of sitting around drawing because I just drew and painted, and that's all I did when I was young. I mean, obsessively, I didn't do anything else, didn't play sport, didn't do anything else. got picked last for cricket, football, everything. I wasn't as theatrical as Barry. Barry sat with his back to the goalposts knitting at Melbourne. I wasn't, you know, I'm not theatrical in that way. But, you know, so I remember meeting the old man. I was just drawing parts of the architecture and things like that. It's an interesting place for a suburban 12-year-old, you know, look at this, you know. And this old guy came up, Jorgensen, and said, "Ah, you like sketching, do you?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He goes, yes. And then he wandered off with his stick. So that's my only
That's your
personal
contact.
that's my only personal connection to the place.
Would they have been almost, I suppose, ostracised from the peers that you speak of historically?
Montsalvat.
Yeah.
Well,
The itself,
yeah.
history was quite negative.
Well, you see the lecturers at Paran when I was there, starting at 16, well, you know, had complete contempt for all that. You know, it was sort of like he was doing sort of painting in the style of Rembrandt, lots of portraits, self-portraits and things. And then there were jewellers and there were potters and there was all this sort of stuff. But it was seen by the kind of the people who thought they were cutting edge in the groovy 70s, you know, what the high point of Western civilization, that you know, that these guys were throwbacks, and so yeah, they didn't countenance them at all really. So
That's the impression I got.
that's right. That'd be right. That would be because I never hung out in the art world. I'd never have time. I'm too busy trying to make a picture work, and that was always the case. So I wasn't always at, you know, Chapman Powell Street Gallery to see David Wilson's latest sculpture show, you know, like all these people who were doing things, but it was a scene. There's always a scene. Yeah. That was a scene. The Montsalvat thing was a scene. I've never really felt like I was, you know, part of a scene. There's a more economical one of not wanting to be a member of a club that would have you. It's Samuel Golan, MGM. Samuel Golan said, "Include me out." That's the short one. Yeah, so it's just, I don't know, I just feel like I just need to be left alone to, you know, go on my own little path, for better or worse. So I could never have been a part of that community in a place like Montsalvat, or even the hipsters in Paran having shows in South Yarra and wherever they were, you know. John Davis, very nice man, good sculptor. A whole bunch of people who I knew, but it was just, and the photographers, John Williams and Paul Cox, who made films as well, and yeah, John Cato and people like that, Rennie Ellis, people like that. But it's just, you know, not really. It wasn't like I didn't feel groovy being in a scene. I felt groovy if I made a picture I thought was all right. That was about it. So.
Yeah.
Probably just too selfish, I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill.
Anyway, I don't know. I hope that thing about space made sense, because that's quite important. And the thing about these things which are amazing, for me, in any art form, have got this kind of, it's just like you can't, you know, just how did someone do that, you know? And that's gathering sense of disbelief, which, then that you keep it with you for the rest of your life, I think. Yeah, so it's hard to talk about these things, and you go round it and round it because, you know, I'm not a poet, but the thing is, it's hard to nail it down sometimes. Yeah.
Well, I think what you've done is given us things to freshen our brains up and think about things back at home. And if we don't understand it now, we'll be exploring it for perhaps more of our life.
Yeah, well, you don't understand. I mean, it's like that old thing, the more you read, the more you realise how little you've read, you know, so it keeps on getting stranger. You know, and that's one of the great things that art does. It makes the world strange again. And in a funny kind of way, that means it turns you back into a child where, you know, what is this? And it was Einstein who said mystery is the most beautiful thing in the world, scientist. And all of the really great scientists were all obsessed with one aspect of the arts. Oppenheimer, it was kind of classical literature and poetry, you know. Einstein, they all drew something from art. And there's a great thing at the very end of Civilization, the TV series that Kenneth Clark made, Civilization, which is unbelievable. wow, that's so good, that program. It's the first personalised documentary made in 1969. It's the first time someone stood in front of a camera and talked about something. It's the first time it's ever been done. It was done by a genius called Peter Gill, I think his name was. And after that they made Ascent of Man. No, they made America with Alistair Cook, and then they made Ascent of Man, the Jacob Bronowski thing. 3 in a row, and it's only because of those that we now have like David Attenborough and everyone else. Everyone else has done it. All came from that. Anyway, Kenneth Clark was sort of saying now he was standing in front of Jodrell Bank, the radio telescope. This is in 1969. He says now science has they've split the atom and all this has happened. Now science has taken on this quasi mystical relationship with nature that art has always had.
It's always been there.
Yeah.
It's always will be.
Yeah.
Yeah.